Thank you so much to Ben for putting this panel together, and apologies for my absence. I was really excited to participate, but ironically I couldn't be here today because of the Jewish holidays. But I am putting the questions of the use of technology in the virtual and religious life to practice in a particularly meta kind of formulation. I also really want to thank the tech staff at the Annenberg School who are allowing me to come to you in a clearer format than my partner's cell phone, which had been my original plan. This paper today about Judaism and accounting, and in particular the use of technology and its relationship to accounting and counting ways of thinking in the Chabad movement of Judaism, is actually quite timely, given the recent spate of reporting about ultra-Orthodox or Haredi attitudes towards technology and the internet. And it's timely because in some senses it's in consonance with what has been reported, and it's also challenging because it's presenting a different view. I'm going to talk briefly about the Jewish community known as Chabad, an acronym for the terms Chochmah, Bina, Dat, which are three separate Hebrew words for different ways of knowing or kinds of knowledge, all of which are part of the Hasidic tradition rooted in mysticism and joy in practice. And I don't want to get too deeply into it, but I did want to just mention that the Chabad community itself is in many ways quite renegade and quite revolutionary. And it's important to remember that in certain ways this group still maintains that tradition within quite a normative Orthodox framework. And I want to say this because I think that a lot of the reporting has seemed to indicate that Orthodoxy or ultra-Orthodoxy within Judaism is a unitary body, and it really, really isn't. There are quite a lot of both minute and very powerful and meaningful distinctions. I mentioned joy of practice, and it is indeed practice that I want to focus on today. So this paper will focus on the relationship between practice and counting in biblical and rabbinic conceptions of Jewish obligations. I want to argue that the biblical emphasis on counting strongly frames the Chabad approach to Judaism as a practice-oriented religion. The rabbinic notion of a divine database, as this panel is called, sees direct application in the media-savvy community of Chabad, whose notions of religious obligation are intimately tied to and furthered by their application of technology. The connection between technology, religion, and accounting, I argue, is rooted in rabbinic interpretations of biblical databases, framed around a notion of the divine as an account. This approach is fundamental to the framing of Jewish obligation around practice rather than thought or intention, a framing that emerges directly out of biblical engagements with numeric or database technology. So that's the overall project. I'm only going to get to focus on a very tiny part of it today, though I suspect I'm still going to go over my time because I don't have anybody holding up pictures telling me how long I have left. A lot of this way of thinking, or a lot of the things that I'm starting to think about, emerge around the differences between orthoprax or orthopraxy, which is to say right practice, as opposed to orthodoxy or right thinking. Judaism is, as a religion, largely about practice rather than about belief. Belief is important, but intentionality matters less than what you actually do. And this plays out really strongly in the ways in which what is considered a good deed or a bad deed is meted out. And I'll get into that a little bit, but I want to say that part of this question of practice is about not beliefs, but actions or deeds. So the things that you do are the things that get counted as credit. So Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is perhaps the most powerful day in the Jewish calendar, is in fact a day in which all of your good deeds are balanced against all of your bad deeds. And the scale itself becomes a metaphor, not for that day alone, but for Judaism as a whole. It's a powerful ordering symbol, and there are many others, but because Yom Kippur has taken on such a strong presence in the Jewish life cycle and the life calendar, I think it's fair to say that this idea of the scale is a really big metaphor. And I want to emphasize that I'm talking today about notions of observance, not cultural experience per se, but I will get back to the importance of cultural experience at the end of the talk. Now, very quickly, the basic premise of the ways in which Chabad approaches its outreach within the Jewish community is that it gets people to do activities of commandments, so to perform the commandments. And for them, the intention doesn't necessarily matter because they think of a giant database in which the more good deeds, the more mitzvot, the more commandments performed by Jews, the closer we as a world come to the Messianic age. So someone had pointed out to me that the Chabad attitude towards the performance of commandments is very similar to ideas of big data. It's the consolidation of lots of information without the need for human actors' intentionality to get meaningful information. And in this case, the meaningful information is both the good deeds and the dawning of the Messianic age. And when I was a kid, this was often explained to me by the classic example of somebody walking down the street whose wallet happens to fall and money happens to go into the arms of a beggar standing beside him or her, which is an unlikely scenario, but was interesting. And the idea we were taught is that the person whose wallet fell out would in fact get credit for that good deed, despite the fact that there was no intention to actually give charity. And again, here's the idea of not just the fact that it's the practice that matters, but that there's credit, there's an accounting that happens, there's somebody keeping the record. Judaism is only partly orthoprax. There is some space for belief, of course, but that is particularly in Chabad's framework secondary. This attitude plays out strongly in Chabad's use of technology. The website itself as a physical object is designed to rack up credits. It's all about practice, and it's all about enrolling practice immediately through just interacting with the space of the website. And a close reading of the site itself emphasizes this. It's detail-oriented. It's heavily focused around practice and application rather than ideology, and I'll get back to that in a bit. Now, Chabad itself and this kind of notion of accounting is actually drawing from Judaism as a whole, where accounting is really a very, very strong theme in both biblical and rabbinic notions. And I can't get into it too much, but we do have the early example of the census. But that's only one of many ways that Judaism is a religion of record keeping and accounting. And it's true biblically. It's true, as I said, in the imagination and the imagery of the religion on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The idea that all sins and good deeds are weighted and massed against each other, and if the good deed outweighs the number of the bad deeds, where there's a favorable judgment on Yom Kippur. But the day is also a time of atonement for bad deeds, for asking for forgiveness, for tilting the balance in favor of good deeds, if it might be equal. So this is a divine database with very real stakes, because there are consequences to the way in which the scale falls. And while it feels like it might be a mystical moment or a magical moment, this moment of, divine accounting, it's actually a very straightforward arithmetic story. And again, what counts as a good deed is very much about practice. It's not a story about ideology or faith or even intentionality per se. And one can actually argue that the self-audit or soul-searching of this time is to infuse the very practical experience with some ideological, philosophical, or reflective context. So how does this play out in the technological realm? In particular, to what extent does Chabad, the most media-savvy Jewish entity, and one that is also deeply traditional, use technology in service of its deeply held commitment to divine databases? Chabad was smart. The Chabad website was one of the very first Jewish websites, and this is not accidental. They started using technology and building its online presence very, very early, way back in 1988, in fact. And they early appreciated the ability to reach a large audience using explicit outreach rhetoric through the launching of their site, which happened in 1998. And Chabad and its affiliated sites have 7.6 million visitors monthly, which is a staggering number when you consider the number of Jews worldwide. So they embraced the internet early, even when other ultra-Orthodox communities were banning it entirely, as many still do. Why? Part of it is about how Chabad viewed the internet. It's totally in keeping with their philosophy of education and outreach, but also totally in keeping with a broader notion of accounting and orthopraxy. Chabad, as I said, has entirely embraced the practice aspect of Judaism, and they are using the internet as a way to further this goal. They see the internet as a way to collect data and get more points. So the data I'm referring to here and the collection I'm referring to here is the execution of good deeds, of practice of Judaism. And it's a movement based on messengers who contact other Jews and get them to perform these good deeds, whether or not they know why. And in a way, the internet is another one of these messengers, but a particular kind of messenger, and I'll get to that in a second. Chabad itself is very aware of the seeming delicate dance of an ultra-Orthodox embrace of the internet and the paradoxical status of being the most media-savvy Jewish entity. I mean, you could imagine that there are other spaces that would perhaps be more media-savvy. There's a slight defensive note in the way that they discuss technology as well, but their self-awareness does mean that there are a lot of spaces one can turn to think about how Chabad itself thinks about the internet. And I'm going to very briefly cite some of these spaces. I'm going to use the words of the most recent Chabad patriarch or dynastic leader, the late Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who wrote that the divine purpose of the present information revolution, for instance, which gives an individual unprecedented power and opportunity, is to allow us to share knowledge, spiritual knowledge with each other, empowering and unifying individuals everywhere. We need to utilize today's interactive technology not just for business or leisure, but to interlink as people, to create a welcome environment for the interaction of our souls, our hearts, our visions. Understanding science and technology as divine tools for our personal and spiritual growth is critical for our well-being. It is well and good to learn to program a computer, but unless a student also acquires a sense of discipline and integrity, he or she might just as easily use that skill to wreak technological havoc as to obtain a job. So here we have language about discipline, about self-education, about using the internet to further the work of humankind. And elsewhere, Schneerson warns against, quote, where we have fallen short is in integrating these spheres of knowledge. Only by balancing the scientific with the spiritual can we transform the dream of an ideal future into a functional blueprint for society. For true communication can only begin when human minds and souls interact. With communication comes understanding. With understanding comes compassion. And with compassion comes a natural movement towards universalism. So we have this kind of very Yoda-esque coda, and because I'm not there, I can't tell if you're laughing. I hope you are, and I hope you're laughing now. But it also summarizes the really careful position that Chabad is carving out around the use of technology. It's one that's very much in keeping with the Jewish idea that anything that can be both sacred and profane. There are very few absolute evils. But it's also furthering the idea that the internet itself is a tool to gain a certain end, which is to say, here connecting humankind, here getting people to be linked, here getting people to perform good deeds. There's some distancing in this language from the narrative of orthopraxy, because there's the need to use judgment in activities, because the technology cannot deliver the human nuance. It cannot deliver that moment of what is right and what is wrong, and it also, importantly, cannot deliver the joy. Practice matters. The divine database matters. But remember one of the other tenets of Chabad, and one of the ways in which it was revolutionary, and that was the embrace of joy in practice. And the joy cannot be delivered online in the same way, and nor can the sense of authenticity, and these are the two great secrets to Chabad's success. And these ideas are very much vested in biblical notions of the role of the database or counting in the practice of the Israelite tradition. And again, I can't get into it here, but if you have any questions about the role of counting in the biblical tradition, please do get in touch. And here I'm just going to sum up really quickly. For Chabad, the digital is another way of enrolling practice without necessarily requiring intention. A way of notching up credits in the good column, an extension of the emissary whose goal it is to get you to do rather than get you to think. And the thing you're doing is another good deed. While their website is impressively comprehensive and meticulous, it is also unaccidentally detail-oriented. It is supposed to make you act. A close reading of the website, from its layouts to its headings, are all geared towards practice. So there are two columns with hyperlinks. On the left-hand side, there are events, holidays, and practice. And only then are there learning and values about why to do these various things. And on the right-hand side is a data entry section to get details about when one ought to, for example, light candles, when the holidays do commence. So this is, again, a very data and practice-oriented approach. And for Chabad, technology is a way to further practice, which is really rooted in the rabbinic notions of the fundamental reasons for practice. But ultimately, for Chabad, the technology is just a flawed delivery system. I started this project by asking what is enabled by ignoring belief, the magical, the mystical, in a method of accounting and tabulation as the framework for a religious system and a technological approach. But I'm wrong, as I discovered. And again, I can only paint in broad strokes. The Chabad story, the story of their notion of the divine database, remains a magical and mystical one, because while they are deeply committed to practice and while belief fundamentally at the core of the many ideals is not a requirement, what is a requirement is joy. what is a requirement is experience. And that abstraction can't be counted and can't ultimately be delivered by the digital technology. Instead, a far more powerful technology, the human actors, the flesh and blood messengers and teachers, are required in order to mediate, in order to decide what to do with the technology. And in Chabad ideology, the machine is a secondary. The machine enables one to rack up deeds, but the divine database does, in the end, take into account something far more abstract as well, something that cannot quite, in our terms, be counted. And that is experience, the experience of joy. Thank you.